So essentially, we have a 3-year strategic plan. I won't go through a lot of this in any detail. The mission will be familiar to people. The vision is what we want to see in the longer term, throughout the length of this strategic plan and further out in time. And one of those things that we want to see is a secure, low-carbon future. And essentially what the key focus for the next 3 years of the Commission for Regulation of Utilities will be is in these 4 circles, essentially. And one of those is to deliver sustainable low-carbon solutions. And essentially that's one of the priorities that CRU is focusing on over the next period. And essentially, up to this point in time, our strategic plans would have really taken our legislative duties and presented them all as essentially strategic. But one of the outcomes of the OECD review of the Commission last year, throughout last year and the year before, was that it is appropriate for us to choose from within that very broad range of duties things that we think are strategic and important. So essentially the rest of my presentation, there'll be a little bit about Brexit at the end for the day that's in it, but essentially the rest of my presentation will be low on opinions and high on dull facts. Mere facts, perhaps. So this is mostly stolen from a report that was published by the Market Monitoring Group in the RAs, in the utility regulator, actually. So essentially, this covers the SEM market, so not the ISEM. The ISEM was the project to move it from the old SEM to the new SEM. So by law, we still call it the SEM. So essentially, what you can see there, the fuel mix for the period. So 33% wind, of interest to yourselves. Significant amount of peat there, which many will say is high carbon effect of the peat. Very small amount of coal, reflective perhaps of the fact that there were outages on the Money Point plants, as well as perhaps where they would have been in the merit order, and a significant amount of gas. Essentially, one of the key learnings over the first 4 months covered by this is that the interconnectors are flowing as efficiently as they could be. It's difficult to conceive of a mechanism whereby the interconnectors between GB and Ireland could perform better than they have performed. And the other real thing to note is that well, okay, there are a lot of things to note, but the ex-ante markets is where a lot of the business is being done. And I know that some of the conversations are that, especially for the wind industry, the difficulty of predicting what they will generate in the ex-ante market, and is it 70-30, 80-20? What's a reasonable expectation to put on the wind industry that they should be able to predict their demand the day before? Some of Evie's analogies were about leaving the calm harbour and out into the wild sea. Well, people can go out to sea. All they need is a good weather forecast. And essentially, I think the weather forecast analogy holds for wind participating in the ex-ante market. One of the other aspects that has changed since the 1st of October is essentially the capacity remuneration auctions. And thus far, that has delivered lower clearing prices in the second T-1 than in the first T-1. That may change over time as new entry is required. So, and it will change based upon the amount bought, the rules under which it's bought, and essentially the competitive dynamic in the market. And that's essentially the second part there is the interconnector flows. I'll show you a graph that shows that in kind of intuitive way later on. But essentially, the interconnectors are being used to I think really the maximum extent possible, it would be fair to say. So prices and the impact of wind. Essentially, you can read this really for yourself, but in periods of high wind, you can see that effect on the day-ahead price. There's a few things to note. One is if you compare this year to last year, as I think one of the earlier speakers did, or Q4 of 18 to Q4 of 17, there's a few things to note. One is that the price of wholesale gas has increased, and the other is there really were a significant number of unplanned outages over that period. It's always difficult to compare one season to the previous season. And also demand did increase significantly over the period. I mean, a 7% increase in demand is not insignificant. So prices have increased from one year to the next. There's no explanation of the axes there, but you can see essentially the price going up when the wind generation was lower. You will all be familiar with some of these pictures, but essentially ignoring the forwards market for the minute, which you can say is your PPAs, whether they're corporate or government-backed. But essentially, what was the expected behaviour of wind when we changed from one market essentially to three markets? And one was that wind was expected to be active in the day ahead, and that essentially the forecasting, or from a wind participant's viewpoint, the wind forecasting would be the piece that would be active in the intraday. For suppliers, perhaps the demand forecasting would be the piece that will be active in the intraday, and for thermal generators, unexpected outages, etc., would be the element that would be or the reverse, would be the element that would be expected in the intraday. And really, before the market started, people would have expected that everyone, really, would minimise their exposure to the balancing market, and in particular wind. Perhaps not in particular wind, but everyone. So essentially, where did taking all the ex-ante markets, where did the energy get traded? So essentially, the big one there is the day ahead. So around 93% of energy is traded in the day ahead, and then you see splits between the various different intradays. The one on the right-hand side being the intraday continuous, and the three different auctions happening at different points in the day, 1, 2, and 3. The first two, unless I'm mistaken, are connected to GB, and the last two, in other words, intraday 3 and continuous, is essentially island of Ireland only. So you'll have seen some prices like this before from Evie's presentation. So this is the first 70 days. I will admit that those of you who are eagle-eyed will see that I'll quote a price here and I'll have quoted a different price earlier. But I just took it from the presentation, or the publicly available document. I'll pass any of your questions on to the team later. But this is essentially the first 70 days. Hard enough to read, but the big blue lines are the market volume, and the SEM price is the sharp line. So the value over the period, about £500 million. The average here, I say, the average daily price note is 71.24 euros per megawatt hour. The largest hourly, though I can't find it really on that graph because those are dailies. The average hourly 0, or the lowest hourly rather 0, and the max in the day ahead 281. And I won't go into this too much. I'll leave it up there. The presentation either is already available or will be available to share. And you'll see that essentially the prices tend to increase as you go through the intraday markets. And one might infer from that the closer you are to the balancing market, the more you don't want to be there as a buyer, perhaps. And the values of the markets, again, similar to what you saw, that the bulk of the value is in the day ahead. The bulk of the transactions, or the value of the transactions in any event, is in the earlier ones, and it declines as you get closer to the day, to the day, I guess. The balancing market, and this might appear unspectacular or spectacular depending on who you are. Essentially, the blue is the direction of the imbalance and the size of the imbalance, and the darker lines are the presumably the half-hour imbalance prices. And you will see some very high prices there at times. You will also, I'm sure, as the wind energy note, the negative prices. And essentially, negative prices have a place in a market. Whilst concerns have been expressed about the evolution of prices in the balancing market, and the SEM committee takes on those concerns, so we're not denying that there are concerns about the evolution of prices in the balancing market, and we're not saying that that's not right. And it is a matter that is being examined very closely, and as a matter of urgency, really, that the level of the volatility. But notwithstanding all of that, the balancing market can be expected to be volatile. We can expect to see negative prices, and we can expect to see highly positive prices as well. So we should always expect there to be volatility therein. Now, again, I'll end up repeating myself, but there have been concerns expressed about the level of that, and SEMC is taking those concerns seriously. This is the interconnector flow theoretical diagram. Essentially, before the 1st of October, this would have appeared more like a scatter graph, or to use the pictorial analogy earlier, a blob of paint of different colours thrown on a screen by Van Gogh and worth millions. But today it's not quite as abstract. And in essence, the way to read this, and I will have to read exactly what it says down there because I cannot remember this. The x-axis is the day-ahead market, and it's the prices comparing SEM and GB. So on the right-hand side, as you see it, the SEM price is higher than the GB price. So on the right-hand side of the x-axis, the SEM price is higher than the GB price. So you would expect to see import, okay? And on the y-axis, is volume and flow. So you'll see the direction of the flow, and the further out the y-axis you go, the more the flow there is. And on the top side, you would see import. So in essence, I pressed the wrong button. Yeah, in essence, I'll try and use the microphone whilst pointing. In essence, there should be import, and there is import. And the import goes up to the maximum that the blue line, which is EWIC, can manage, and thereafter it is maxed out. So even though the price differential is increasing, we can't push any more stuff out. And similarly, in the opposite direction, when the stuff should be flowing out, it is flowing out, and when this machine hits its maximum, it just can't do any more. And the maximum here, essentially, the reason for the two lines is there are slightly different maxima in the different directions, and it can change, or it has changed, I think, over the course of that graph. So really, in the bad old days, this would have gone in all sorts of wrong directions all sorts of times because of essentially the ownership of the rights to use the interconnectors was not necessarily always going to line up with the price differentials in the market. And essentially in the high-level design, given that the two particular interconnectors were essentially 100% on the island of Ireland side in terms of ownership and underwriting, it was possible to move to 100% implicit allocation. And that just means that the markets happen, the price differential says this is how much is needed to flow and can flow, and that's where the revenues for the interconnectors come from. The flows just go in the directions that the price evolution says they should. And perhaps the gentleman from Priory can explain how there is a more efficient way if there is one, but I'm not sure there is. So essentially what that says is that the interconnectors are flowing in the best direction at the day ahead time. And whilst we saw earlier I think it may have been Evie's presentation, she showed the evolution of the price in GB and the contemporaneous evolution of the price in Ireland, and compared it then to the evolution in the same period of the SEM the year before. The volatility in the SEM the year before and the volatility in the SEM now are perhaps useful things to compare. But once the interconnectors are maxed out, and you can see that they do get maxed out in both directions, well then the prices will diverge from GB to Ireland. So the amount of space in the interconnectors will determine the level of price coupling, and the price coupling has been better than it was before. So essentially you are trading in a bigger market than you were before, and that should be a matter of comfort. So for the day that's in it, and with 4 minutes left, as the clock ticks down, we'll talk about Brexit. So I think last week it was CRU published a note on what we think might happen if there were to be a no-deal Brexit. This week the utility regulator published very, very similar wording. And essentially, and my taxi driver asked me about this in the car on the way over. So essentially, gas will continue to flow. There's an intergovernmental treaty covering the gas interconnectors. The platform on which space in the gas interconnectors is sold is something called Prisma, and access to that platform will continue on both sides, even in the event of a disorderly or no-deal Brexit in a matter of hours, however, 400 hours or whatever it is. And in terms of electricity, the single electricity market will continue. The highly efficient east-west flows may not be as efficient, but nevertheless, trade will still be settled on an all-island basis. Trade will still happen east-west, unaffected really in the intraday space. So in the intraday 1 and intraday 2 will be coupled with GB. But essentially the efficiency that you can see in what is a pan-European market, GB will no longer be in that pan-European market, so some of those efficiencies will no longer be there. It should still be better than it was in the old SEM. Interconnector flows will still be allocated on the basis of the price differential implicitly, but the benefit of being in the pan-European market will no longer be there. And I suspect, no, there's more. Essentially, I've said, I think, all of that. So the CRU will seek to minimise the loss of efficiency, working in conjunction with DCCAE and EirGrid, and through engagement with the European Commission. But however, trade will continue with Great Britain unaffected in the intraday. And I do think, I say even more, I forget. Of interest to yourselves as well, and more wind is providing system services. So the DS3 and the CRM elements of the markets will continue, and any contracts, all contracts in the T-4, which is to happen on Friday the 28th, I think Saturday is the 29th. Yes, it is there. Friday the 28th, the T-4 auction will proceed, and regardless of any type of Brexit, contracts awarded in this auction will be honoured. And I'm almost certain that's my last slide, yes. Thank you very much.